Hello. Let's keep reading the Saturdays. We left off in the middle of Saturday number 2, the first week that a Melendi child has gone off by themselves. It is Randy's turn this first week. She has taken the money that all of the Melendi children have collected, and she is going to visit an art museum. She has been looking at the paintings there, where she ran into an old acquaintance, Mrs. Oliphant. Randy discovered that Mrs. Oliphant was the subject of one of these paintings. And now the two companions have gone to a restaurant where Mrs. Oliphant is about to tell Randy the story of her childhood and how that painting came to be. "Well, it's a long time ago," said the old lady. "Before you were born, even before your father was born. Imagine it. The garden in the picture was the garden of my father's house in Saint-Germain near Paris. It was an old house even then, tall and narrow and gray, with patches of ivy. The inside of it was stuffy and dark and full of furniture. When house cleaning was going on, all the windows were opened, never any other time, and I can remember the smell of it to this day, the mixed odors of cloth and cough medicine and age. I was the only young thing in the house. Even Tartuffe, the dog, was older than I. My mother had died when I was born, and my father's business kept him in Paris all day. So I was brought up by my aunts and an English governess. They gave me my lessons, too. I was never allowed to go to school. The aunts were all maiden ladies years older than my father. They always wore black, took pills with their meals, worried about drafts, and spoke in quiet, polite voices, except when shouting at Tante Amélie, the deaf aunt, who carried a great curved ear trumpet like the tusk of an elephant. Ah, here is the tea." Francois arranged the feast before them. Petit fours turned out to be the most wonderful little cakes in frilled paper collars, pink and pale yellow and chocolate, with silver peppermint buttons on top. Randy's eyes glittered with such enthusiasm that the old lady was delighted. "You shall have some to take home to the other children. Francois, please bring us a boxful of petit fours to take home." "That will be wonderful," Randy said, not quite with her mouth full, but almost. "Please tell me some more." "Very well," said her friend. The English governess was also a spinster, also elderly. Her name was Miss Buff Towers, and she was related in some way to an earl, a fact she was very proud of and never forgot. She had long front teeth, the color of old piano keys, and a huge coiled arrangement of braided hair on top of her head, like an orderly eagle's nest. She was a kind-hearted creature, but she knew as much about raising children as I know about raising coati mundis. I'm not even sure what they are. You can see that my life was far from exciting. I knew no children, rarely left my own home at all. If it hadn't been for the garden, I might have gone mad from boredom. This garden was very large, enclosed by a high wall, and shaded by old chestnut trees that bloomed every spring in great cornucopias of popcorn. There was a tiny bamboo jungle, and a summer house with a wasp's nest, and a little lead fountain, and 2 enormous mossy statues, one of Diana and one of Apollo. At the end of the garden, the wall was low enough to permit seeing the magnificent view of the city. In the distance, the whole of Paris lay spread out like a map, golden in the morning, blue in the dusk, shining like 1,000 fires at night. I spent all the time I could in the garden. I had a swing there, and many hiding places for myself, my dolls, and Tartuffe. I used to take my lessons to the wall at the end, looking up from my dull books every other minute to see the city far beyond. I never tired of looking at it and wondered about it. One September evening, when I was 11 years old, I had gone into the garden, and was sitting in my usual place on the wall looking at the city and hoping dinner would be ready soon. I heard steps on the little gravel path behind me, and, turning, saw my father and another gentleman, a friend whom he had brought home for dinner. I stood up respectfully, and was introduced to Monsieur Clairon. He was a tall man with a brown beard and pleasant eyes. I had a feeling, looking at him, that he was more alive than most people. "Your daughter makes me think of the princess in a fairy tale who looks out of her tower at the world," he told my father. "Some day I would like to paint her just as she was, sitting on that wall." I was flattered and self-conscious, but only for a moment. "We mustn't make her vain, Jules," said my father in a stately voice. "That plain little face was never meant for art." Dinner for once was fun. Monsieur Clairon told jokes and stories, everybody laughed, and each story was repeated in loud praise for Tante Amélie with the greatest goodwill. "I've been making sketches at the carnival down the street," he told me. "I can never resist carnivals. This one has a camel and a dancing bear, as well as the usual carousel and fortune-tellers. It makes good pictures. You've seen it, I suppose, mademoiselle?" He turned to me. "No, monsieur," I said sadly. I knew there was a carnival somewhere in the town. Bursts of music had been drifting over the wall all day. "But you must see it," Monsieur Clairon insisted. "It leaves at midnight. I should be happy to take you this evening." "Heaven forbid, Jules," said my father, with a distressed smile. "Gabrielle would come home with smallpox, or whooping cough, or measles, or all three." "And so dreadfully dirty," added Miss Buff Towers. "Someone might even kidnap her," said my Tante Marthe, who always expected the worst. "It's out of the question," stated my father firmly. For the first time since I was a tiny child, I dared to defy the collective opinion of my aunts, father, and governess. "But I want to go," said I, laying down my fork. "I want to go terribly. Why can't I? I'll wear gloves and not touch anything, I promise. When I come home, I'll gargle. Please let me go, please, please, please." My father stared at me. Even his eyebrows and mustache looked annoyed. "That will be enough, Gabrielle," he said. "You never let me go anywhere," I persisted. "I've never seen a carnival, or a real live camel, or a dancing bear. I'd like to see something besides just this old house all the time." My father's face was dark as the wine in his glass. "Go," he roared. "Upstairs, immediately, without dessert." And up I went, crying into my sleeve and hearing above my sobs the turmoil in the dining room. Monsieur Clairon interceding for me, my father expostulating, and above that the loud toneless voice of Tante Amélie saying, "What's the matter? Why is Gabrielle crying? Why doesn't someone tell me something?" And Tante Marthe bellowing into the ear trumpet, "Gabrielle has been a very naughty girl." After I had gone to bed, and Miss Buff Towers had heard my prayers, and wept a few embarrassing tears over my disobedience, I lay in bed very still and straight and angry. Through the closed window I could hear rowdy strains of music. At last I got out of bed and opened the window which looked out over the garden and the distant lighted city spread like a jeweled fabric. For the first time I was sorry that my room was not at the front of the house, since then I might have glimpsed the carnival. The music sounded happier than ever, and I could hear bursts of laughter above the noise. Slowly my anger turned to curiosity and active rebellion. An adventurous flame sprang to life within me. Quickly, in the dark, I dressed in my oldest dress. Quickly, I stuffed the bolster under the blankets, just in case someone should look in. But money. I wanted to ride on the carousel and to see the dancing bear. There were only 20 centimes in my pocket, and then I remembered the gold piece. My father had given it to me on my last birthday. At the time I had been disappointed, but now I was glad. I took it out of its box, put it in my pocket with the 20 centimes, and cautiously opened the door to the hall. The fat bronze goddess on the upstairs landing was brandishing the gas lamp like a hand grenade. Downstairs I heard my father shout, "Why don't you move your queen?" and knew that he was playing chess with Tante Amélie. I turned back to my room and closed the door behind me. Nothing was going to stop me now. I went over to the window and opened it again. Aged ivy covered the walls at either side, and, scared to death in my clumsy old-fashioned clothes, I reached out among the leaves till I felt a strong stem like a cable, stepped over the iron grill in front of the window, and, with a breathless prayer, began my descent. Very awkward it was, too. I made a lot of noise, and all the sparrows in the ivy woke up and flew chattering away. About 6 feet above the ground, the ivy ripped away from the wall, and down I went with a crash into a fuchsia bush. I sat there listening to my heart and waiting for the entire household to come out with lanterns. But nothing happened. After an eternity, I got up and stole out of the garden. Both the knees had been torn out of my stockings. I was dirty, and my hair was full of ivy twigs, but it didn't matter. In less than 5 minutes, I had arrived at the carnival. It was even better than I had hoped, full of crowds and bright lights and noise. The carousel with its whirling painted horses and its music was like nothing I had ever seen before. I rode on it twice, and when I screamed with excitement, nobody paid any attention because they were all doing the same thing. After that, I bought a ride on a camel. That took some courage, as I had never seen a camel before, and did not know that they possessed such sarcastic faces. Have you ever ridden one? Never, said Randy. You must try it sometime. It made me a little seasick, but I enjoyed it. Then I went and watched the dancing bear softly rocking to and fro on his hind paws like a tipsy old man in bedroom slippers. There was too much to see. I was dazzled and just walked about staring blissfully. I was fascinated by the fortune-teller's booth. It was really a large wagon with a hooped roof, which you entered by a pair of wooden steps. On one side there was a large placard bearing the words, Zenaida, world-renowned seeress and soothsayer. Advice and prophecy on affairs of business or the heart. Palmistry, cards, or crystal as preferred. On the other side there was a life-sized picture of a dark, beautiful woman gazing into a crystal globe. I hesitated only a moment. Then I mounted the steps, parted the flaps of the tent, and entered. Inside the tent was draped with shabby shawls of many colors. Overhead a red glass lantern cast a murky light, and at a small table sat a gypsy woman, glittering and jingling with earrings, clattering bracelets and necklaces. She looked almost nothing like the picture outside. She was older, and her fingernails were dirty. I was dreadfully disappointed. "What do you want, kid?" she said. Her voice was hoarse and rough, as though she had spent her whole life shouting. To have my fortune told?" I stammered. "Got any money?" asked the old woman doubtfully, looking at my torn stockings and dirty dress. "Yes," I said. "Let me see it," she demanded. I brought the gold piece out of my pocket. The gypsy examined it craftily. Then she smiled a wide, delighted smile. One of her teeth was black. "You must have found that in a well-lined pocket," said she. At first I did not understand what she meant. Then I was angry. "I never stole anything in my life," I told her. "My father gave it to me for a present." "Your father? He is a rich man?" "I suppose he is," I said. "I don't know. I never thought about it. Anyway, I don't think I want you to tell my fortune after all." Quick as a cat, the gypsy sprang from her chair and barred the entrance. "Forgive me, mademoiselle," she wheedled. "I didn't realize. Your clothes are torn and you have such a dirty face. Come and sit down. I'll tell you a fortune you'll never forget. Splendid, wonderful things are going to happen to you. I see luck shining all around you." Well, who could resist that? In spite of myself, I was soon seated opposite Zenaida, my dirty hand in her dirtier one. Before she began to read my palm, she called out in her harsh gypsy voice, "Bastien?" A young man's face appeared at the entrance, and Zenaida said something to him in a strange language. The young man nodded, looked at me, and burst out laughing. Then he disappeared. The gypsy lived up to her word. Never was such a fortune told to a human being. Jewels, lovers, fame, travels in far countries, all were promised to me, and I sat there like a half-wit believing every word. "I must go," I said at last. "Please take what I owe you out of this." I gave her the gold piece trustingly. And that, of course, was the last I ever saw of it. "We will drive you home in the wagon," said Zenaida, smiling. I could hear Bastien hitching up the horses outside. "No, thank you," said I. "It's not far, only a little way. If you will give me what you owe me, I will go." I realized that the music had stopped, and a sound of hammering and clattering had taken its place. The carnival was being dismantled. I had been in the wagon for a long time. "We will take you home," Zenaida insisted. "It's almost midnight, and we must be on our way anyhow. Where do you live, and what is your father's name?" Like a fool, I told her. Bastien called to the horses, and the wagon began to move, the red lantern swinging in a slow circle overhead. I was so busy thinking of my glittering future that it was some time before I realized that we must have left my house far behind. When I began asking frightened questions, the gypsy came close to me and grabbed my arm. She told me that I was not going home, but far away, till my father was ready to pay a price to get me back. When I cried and struggled, she called Bastien, and they bound my wrists and ankles and tied a rag over my mouth. All night I lay on the floor in the dark, feeling the wagon lurch and sway, and hearing Zenaida's snores and Bastien's voice swearing at the horses. I was sick with terror. I remained with the gypsies for 3 weeks. The first day, Zenaida unbraided my hair, took away my shoes and stockings, and dressed me in gaudy rags. She pierced my ears for brass earrings, and, stooping down, picked up a handful of earth and rubbed it across my face. "There," she said, "now even a gypsy would think you were a gypsy." In spite of her, and in spite of the letter I was forced to write my father during the second week, telling him where to leave the ransom money if he wished to see me again, I enjoyed many things about those 3 weeks. The wagon and the travel and the going barefoot. The sound of rain on canvas overhead, the noise and smell of the carnival, a noise of bells and talk and music, a smell of garlic and tobacco and people and that camel. But the bad things more than overshadowed the good. Zenaida was cruel, and so was Bastien when he got drunk, which was often. One fine day, we came to a small town in the Loira district. There was a big cathedral on the square, I remember, that looked huge and disapproving beyond the carnival's tawdry, jingling whirl of light and music. When Zenaida was telling fortunes in the wagon, Bastien was supposed to keep an eye on me. I had to stay near the wagon or run the risk of a bad whipping. But on this particular evening, Bastien, a little tipsier than usual, went to sleep under the wagon with his head on his hat. I saw my chance and wandered away. I had no thought of escape. I was too dirty and dispirited, and I had no money. My sheltered life had taught me nothing of fending for myself or what to do in an emergency. However, for the moment, I enjoyed myself watching the familiar sights of the carnival and the many unfamiliar faces. Suddenly, I saw something that made me gasp. Standing under a gas lamp at the outskirts of the crowd was a tall man with a beard. In his hands were a small sketchbook and a pencil. It was Monsieur Jules Clairon, who could never resist a carnival. I ran to him, bleating like a lost sheep. "Oh, Monsieur Clairon, please save me, and take me away from here." Poor man, he looked horrified, and who can blame him? I had accumulated the dirt of 3 weeks. "I don't know any gypsies," said he. "How do you know my name?" "But I'm the princess, don't you remember?" I cried idiotically, and then I explained. "Good Lord," he said, horrified. "I knew nothing about your disappearance. I left Saint-Germain early the next morning on a walking tour." He took me back to the house where he was staying, and the landlady scrubbed me and gave me clean clothes, while he got the police and went back to the carnival. But Zenaida must have found out what had happened, for the gypsy wagon had disappeared. Nobody ever saw it again. As for me, I was rushed home by train the next day. I was embraced by my haggard father, who was relieved on 2 accounts. First, because of my safe return, and second, because the ransom money had never been collected. All my aunts wept over me wetly, and I had to have my hair washed every day for 2 weeks, but in spite of everything, I was glad to be home. When my father begged Monsieur Clairon to tell him how he could reward him, Monsieur Clairon replied, "Allow me to paint the portrait of your daughter." So that is how it came about. Later on, it was he who persuaded my family to send me to school in England. I went to a convent there for 7 years, which, though it would have seemed dreadfully strict to you, was heaven itself as far as I was concerned. Mrs. Oliphant opened a pocketbook like a giant clam, extracted some money to pay the bill, and clapped it shut again. "That's all," she said. Randy rose slowly to the surface and emerged from the story dreamily. "It was wonderful," she said. "Things like that never happen to us. We lead a humdrum life, when I think about it. It's funny how it doesn't seem humdrum." "That's because you have eyes the better to see with, my dear," said Mrs. Oliphant, "and ears the better to hear with. Nobody who has them and uses them is likely to find life humdrum very often, even when they have to use bifocal lenses like me." It was dark when they came out. The rain had stopped, but the streets were still wet, crisscrossed with reflected light. The shop windows were lighted too. In one bright rectangle floated a mannequin in a dress of green spangles, exactly like a captured mermaid in an aquarium. "I go up and you go downtown," said Mrs. Oliphant when they came to Fifth Avenue. She held out her hand. "Thank you for coming to tea." "Oh, thank you very much for inviting me," said Randy. Would you let me come to see you some day?" The old lady looked pleased. "Do come, child. Come by all means, and I'll show you the brass earrings Zenaida made me wear. I kept them for luck. I have a lot of interesting things. Javanese puppets, and a poison ring, and a beetle carved out of an emerald, and the tooth of a charina." "The tooth of a charina?" cried Randy, stopping dead. "That's another story, my dear," said the old lady exasperatingly. A big brontosaurus of a bus clattered to a pause. "This is mine," said Mrs. Oliphant, climbing on it and waving her hand. "Goodbye, Miranda." Randy crossed the street and boarded a big stegosaurus going the other way. At home, she went straight to Rush's room. He was having a peaceful half hour before dinner reading, with his feet on the radiator and the radio going full blast. A voice that made all the furniture tremble was describing the excellence of a certain kind of hair tonic. "Are you worried by the possibility of premature baldness?" inquired the voice, in intimately confidential tones that could be heard a block away. "Does it trouble you to see your once luxuriant hair thinning out?" Randy snapped off the radio. "You don't have to worry about that yet," she said. Rush looked up from his book. "Huh? Oh, hello. Have a good time?" "Wonderful. Guess who I met?" "Mickey Rooney," said Rush. "No, silly," said Randy. "The Elephant. Only, I'm never going to call her that again." "Oh, just the Elephant." Rush was disappointed. "Not just the Elephant. She's swell. She's a friend of mine now, and I'm going to see her. She was kidnapped by gypsies and lived with them for weeks." "Recently?" inquired Rush, startled. No, years ago, when she was a little girl in France. I'll tell you about it after dinner. And look, she sent you these. All of you, I mean." "What are they?" said Rush, taking a bite. "Petit fours," said Randy. "I think it's French. For cakes, probably." "Petit fours," repeated Rush mellowly, through chocolate custard. Not bad at all. So she was kidnapped by gypsies, was she? Do you think the Mrs. Oliphant would care to have me come along with you when you go calling on her?" "I know she would," said Randy. "And Rush, let's go soon and often." Before we go, here's a little sketch of Randy looking at that portrait. And we will pick up with Saturday number 3 next time. Thanks for listening.